The rain had a way of blurring Detroit's hard edges. Streetlights reflected off slick asphalt, and the scent of wet iron clung to the air outside St. Margaret's Catholic High School. It was a kind of night that swallowed sound, where footsteps seemed to dissolve before they echoed, and the city's heart beat in muted rhythm beneath the drizzle. For decades, St. Margaret's had stood as a pillar of faith and discipline on the city's east side, a red brick structure with white stone arches, guarded by a towering crucifix that overlooked the courtyard. To anyone driving by, it appeared timeless, even serene. But behind its worn walls, the echo of an unsolved mystery lingered for 62 years. It began in the winter of 1963, a season so bitterly cold it cracked the river ice and numbed the neighborhood. Back then, the school was smaller, the hallways filled with the clatter of leather shoes and nuns' footsteps. Brother Thomas Keenan, a young basketball coach and physical education teacher, was adored by students. He was only 32, all energy and confidence, with a voice that carried through the gym like the whistle of authority itself. The boys idolized him. The parish trusted him. Nobody questioned his late nights at the gym or the small circle of students he mentored personally. That changed on January 27, 1963. Her name was Mary Ellen Dwyer. 16 years old, quiet, a choir singer with dreams of becoming a nurse. She was last seen after evening practice, wearing her St. Margaret sweater and carrying a stack of books tied with a red ribbon. Witnesses recalled seeing her walk toward the side exit that led to the faculty parking lot. She never made it home. The police searched for weeks. Flyers plastered telephone poles. Reward money was raised. And every parish mass ended with a prayer for her safe return. But Detroit swallowed her whole, and as the snow melted, so did hope. No body. No witnesses. No answers. By spring, the case went cold. Decades passed. St. Margaret's renovated its halls, built a new gymnasium, and replaced the old confessionals with modern woodwork. Brother Thomas moved on to become head coach of the varsity basketball team, turning generations of boys into state champions. He retired in 1995, honored with a framed jersey and a standing ovation in the very gym where Mary Ellen was last seen alive. And for 60 years, he was untouchable, the perfect image of Catholic virtue. Until a single phone call, made from the other side of the country, cracked the silence wide open. In the fall of 2025, Detective Laura Hernandez sat in her cramped office in downtown Detroit, a cup of burnt coffee steaming beside stacks of open files. She had been reviewing cold cases for 2 years, searching for connections missed by generations past. Her days were rhythmic, stale coffee, faded crime photos, and the hum of fluorescent lights above. But that morning, her phone rang, and it wasn't routine. Detective Hernandez? The voice trembled, aged, holding something heavy behind it. My name is Patrick Dwyer. I'm calling from Tempe, Arizona. I think I know what happened to my sister. Patrick Dwyer. The name leapt from the past. The little brother of Mary Ellen. The same boy pictured in every newspaper photo, standing between his weeping parents, clutching his sister's rosary. His voice, now frail and uncertain, carried decades of silence. He told her about a box he found while cleaning out his late mother's belongings. Inside were letters, dozens of them, addressed to Sister Agnes, but signed only with an initial, T. The letters spoke of regret, of a mistake behind the gym, of God's forgiveness for something no penance could ever wash away. Each letter was dated between 1963 and 1965. Detective Hernandez listened in silence, her pen frozen above the notepad. Mr. Dwyer, she said, her voice steady but low, I need you to send that box to me. Everything inside. 2 days later, the package arrived. The handwriting was sharp and deliberate, the ink faded but legible. The confession wasn't direct, but the tone was unmistakable. Each page carried guilt wrapped in religious language, dense with metaphors of sin and judgment. And every mention of a girl was cloaked but present. I see her eyes in every shadow, one line read. I beg him for absolution, but he is silent still. When Hernandez cross-referenced the initials, only one faculty member matched, Brother Thomas Keenan. The same beloved coach who had lived in Detroit his entire life, now 84, residing quietly in a nursing home just outside Grosse Pointe. The department reopened the case. The city reacted first with disbelief, then with outrage. Local news flashed the headline across every screen. 1963 cold case reopened. Police investigate retired Catholic coach. Alumni of St. Margaret's filled social media with defense and denial. He gave us everything, one wrote. That man was a saint, said another. But beneath the noise, whispers began to grow louder. Stories of late practices, of gifts given behind closed doors, of girls who transferred mid-semester without explanation. When detectives visited the old school's archives, they discovered something buried in maintenance records, a line from February 1963 noting water damage in the East storage room, below the gym bleachers. The note was brief, innocuous, but the date matched perfectly with the weeks following Mary Ellen's disappearance. A forensic team arrived at St. Margaret's under the guise of renovation inspection. Beneath cracked concrete and layers of poured sealant, they found what decades of time had hidden: a narrow cavity sealed with stone. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a young girl. Her rosary beads were still intact. The discovery rocked Detroit's Catholic community to its core. The local bishop issued a statement calling for prayer, while senior alumni circulated letters urging calm and reminding the faithful to let truth guide judgment. But for those who remembered 1963, it was like a ghost had walked out of the parish basement. Detective Hernandez didn't believe in coincidences. She stood over the excavation site that night, cold air stinging her lungs as flashlights danced across the unearthed bones. It had been 62 years, yet something about the silence felt fresh, unresolved. One of her younger officers approached, notebook in hand. "If it's her," he murmured, "how did no one notice all this time?" Hernandez stared at the crucifix hanging on the wall above the gym entrance. "Because," she said quietly, "people only see what they want to believe." By morning, authorities had enough evidence to justify an arrest warrant. The letters, the recovered remains, the matching rosary, it all pointed to one man. Detectives arrived at Lakeview Manor nursing home hours later. Brother Thomas sat in a small common room, dressed neatly in a cardigan, a Bible on his lap. The moment Hernandez entered, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. A recognition, maybe, or resignation. "Brother Keenan," she said, showing her badge, "you're under arrest for the murder of Mary Ellen Dwyer." A hush fell over the room. The staff froze. The old man didn't argue. He only closed the Bible, folded his hands, and whispered something only he could hear. As he was led away, the rain began again, soft, relentless, washing over the city that had tried for so long to forget. But some sins, Detroit was learning, don't stay buried forever. The hum of the overhead light was the only sound in the room. Detective Laura Hernandez had been sitting across from Brother Thomas Keenan for nearly 10 minutes, letting the silence brew. The elderly man, now handcuffed, watched the condensation on his water cup as if it might offer him absolution. The interrogation room at the 3rd Precinct was sterile, with walls the color of ash and a mirror that saw everything. It didn't matter that it was nearly midnight. Reporters were already camped outside, shouting for statements, while the city buzzed with disbelief. A living embodiment of Catholic pride had just been arrested for a girl's murder 62 years ago. Hernandez broke the silence first. "Brother Keenan," she said, her voice calm but firm, "do you understand why you're here?" He nodded, slow and deliberate. "Mary Ellen," he murmured. "She's been waiting a long time." Her eyes narrowed. "You remember her?" "I remember everything," he replied. Her voice during choir rehearsals, her kindness. "She used to bring me ginger, snaps her mother baked. The kind with cinnamon on top." Hernandez studied him. His tone wasn't defensive. It was mournful. The kind of tone that came from someone who'd rehearsed regret his entire life. She slid one of the letters across the table. "You wrote this, didn't you?" The old man stared at it. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the faded ink. "Yes," he whispered. "I wrote them all." "Why send them to Sister Agnes?" He looked up, eyes sunken yet sharp. Because confession wasn't enough, he said. The church likes sins to be tidy. Written down, forgiven, forgotten. But this wasn't tidy. No matter how much I prayed, I still saw her. Hernandez leaned forward. Did you kill Mary Ellen Dwyer? He didn't answer, at first. The silence stretched so long that the clicking of the clock became unbearable. Finally, he spoke again, softly, each word deliberate. I tried to help her, he said. She came to me upset. Said someone from the parish had been following her home. I told her I'd take care of it. We met under the bleachers that night so we could talk privately. I promised her she was safe with me. He swallowed hard, eyes glistening beneath the fluorescent light. But she wasn't. God help me, she wasn't. Tell me what happened, brother. Hernandez's pen hovered over her notepad. She panicked, he said. I reached for her arm, just to stop her from leaving, but she screamed. Said she was going to tell the Sister Superior. I tried to quiet her, to make her stop, but she fell. His voice cracked, small and breaking. She hit her head on the step. The sound. I can still hear it. Hernandez's pulse thudded in her ears. So you buried her? He nodded, eyes dropping to his lap. I told Father McGrath. I was terrified. He said the school couldn't survive a scandal, not in those days. He helped me move her under the bleachers. Said the church would handle everything, that God would forgive. We sealed it. We prayed. And we never spoke of it again. Hernandez wrote in silence, her jaw tense. You've lived with that for 60 years, she said finally. How could you serve as a teacher, as a mentor, knowing what you did? Brother Thomas smiled weakly. I thought if I gave my life to God, maybe he'd erase that night. Every trophy I won, every mass I attended, it was penance. But forgiveness never came. When he was escorted out of the room, Hernandez remained seated, staring at the letters scattered across the table. They reeked of guilt, words written by a man drowning in faith and fear. Yet something about his version of events gnawed at her. It was too convenient, too framed for forgiveness. Outside, Detroit's morning light was pushing through the haze. Reporters swarmed the precinct steps, microphones raised, cameras flashing. The words "cold case solved" blared on televisions across Michigan. But in the newsroom of the Detroit Free Press, veteran journalist Samuel King wasn't satisfied. He was 71 now, retired twice, but drawn back by stories like this. He'd covered urban riots, mayoral scandals, the collapse of the auto plants. But this was different. He had gone to St. Margaret's himself as a boy. He knew that gym. He remembered Brother Thomas's sharp whistle echoing across the hardwood floor. He pulled out the old microfilm reels stored in the paper's basement, dust rising under the sickly light of the viewing machine. As he scrolled through the 1963 archives, something caught his eye. In one story dated February 2nd, 1963, there was mention of another missing faculty member. A janitor, Joseph Callahan, age 42. Last seen at St. Margaret's the day after Mary Ellen vanished. Police had chalked it up to a man who'd fled a gambling debt. No one connected his name to the girl's disappearance. Until now. King scribbled notes furiously. Why hadn't Brother Thomas mentioned him? Back at the precinct, Hernandez was reviewing the original property records for the school's basement, trying to track who had access to the old east storage room. Among the signatures was another familiar one, Joseph Callahan. Maintenance. Clearance granted in January 1963. She froze. If Callahan had access, he might have been the one sealing the space. But why wasn't his name ever in the church's internal memos? And what about Father McGrath, the priest who had supposedly handled everything? Church archives listed him as having transferred suddenly in March 1963 to a parish in upstate New York, where he died 1 year later. It was as if the entire parish structure had quietly dismantled itself in the months after Mary Ellen's disappearance. Layers of silence, built like bricks. Each generation of clergy keeping the wall intact. That night, Hernandez sat in her car outside the nursing home where Keenan had lived. The autumn rain coated the windshield again, mirroring the same stillness from the story's beginning. She could see the lights of the city flickering through the mist, alive, but restless. She made a call. "Sam King," she said when the line picked up. "I read your old piece about the school. Do you still have your notes?" "I do," he answered, his voice gravelly. "And I think you're missing a piece, Detective." "Enlighten me." "You're chasing one man's confession," King replied. "But I think you've stumbled into a cover-up. One that goes back to the archdiocese itself." Hernandez gripped the steering wheel. "You're saying the church helped bury a murder?" "I'm saying," King said, "you just found the first body." In that moment, the case shifted. The guilt of one man had opened the door, but behind that door was something darker, a network of secrets safeguarded by silence and sanctity. And as the rain intensified, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and gray, Detective Hernandez felt something she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about truth. Detroit carried its guilt like winter fog, thick, gray, inescapable. After Brother Thomas Keenan's arrest, the city split in two, those who still believed in him and those who never would again. Parish doors closed early, whispers replaced hymns, and the familiar comfort of faith began to rot from the inside. Detective Laura Hernandez sat in her cluttered office, a cup of cold coffee beside case files older than she was. Across from her, journalist Sam King flipped through the brittle pages of diocesan records. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights. "Listen to this," King said. "A letter from Father McGrath to Monsignor Burke, February 1963. His voice hardened as he read aloud. Asterisk, the matter has been contained. The individual remains remorseful. Exposure would destroy more souls than it would save. Asterisk, he set the page down. They didn't seek justice. They sought silence. Hernandez nodded. And they found it under 6 inches of concrete. Father Patrick McGrath had been transferred just weeks after Mary Ellen Dwyer vanished. He died the following year in New York, officially of natural causes. That phrase turned in Hernandez's mind like a loaded gun. Natural deaths didn't follow unnatural crimes. Digging deeper, they uncovered records of hurried renovations at St. Margaret's in February 1963. Payments marked maintenance repair. The contractor was fake. The checks were real. All signed by Monsignor Leonard Burke. They funded the burial, Hernandez said quietly. They used church money to hide her. King scribbled notes. The church buried the truth and gave it a budget line. But one letter in the box caught her attention. McGrath had written again a month later. Asterisk, I beg release from this burden. I fear God's silence more than man's judgment. Asterisk, the signature trembled. To Hernandez, it sounded like confession disguised as obedience. For answers, they flew to Albany, driving through freezing rain to a small monastery where McGrath had spent his final months. The caretaker, Sister Helen, remembered him well. He prayed all night, she said. He cried sometimes. Said the church had built its own grave. She led them to a small box labeled personal effects. Inside was a bound notebook. McGrath's handwriting was sharp but unsteady. One line read, asterisk, forgive me, Lord, for burying truth to protect men. Asterisk the next, asterisk, he ordered obedience, but I fear we'll burn for it. Asterisk. Back in Detroit, forensic tests brought more clarity to the horror. The coroner confirmed Mary Ellen's skull fracture, but also new details, signs of post-mortem movement. Her body had been relocated twice before being sealed beneath the gym. Keenan's story of panic and accident no longer fit. Someone helped him, King said. Question is, who? A missing janitor provided the answer. Joseph Callahan, 42, last seen the morning after Mary Ellen disappeared. Police had once filed him as a runaway gambler, but his family's bank records showed monthly payments for nearly 10 years from a Catholic education fund. Hernandez tapped the ledger. Burke's fund. They paid him off. Every lead pointed back to the Monsignor. In the diocesan archives, his memos sounded almost smug. Asterisk, let grace shoulder what man cannot correct. The faithful must never know despair. Asterisk another simply read, asterisk, silence sustains faith. Asterisk. As they left the building, King muttered, if that's faith, it's built on bones. They next visited the only living witness, Father William Riley, 93, bedbound in a Toledo care home. His hand shook as he reached for his rosary, eyes clouded with guilt. I was there, he whispered. McGrath begged to speak the truth. Burke forbade it, said the community would collapse. So he buried sin beneath the floor and called it sacrifice. Who sealed the room? Hernandez asked softly. Callahan. He did what he was told. Then they paid him to leave. The rest of us were told to forget. Did Burke give the order? The old priest nodded weakly. He said truth must sleep until faith is strong enough to face it. Those words rooted in Hernandez's mind. Truth must sleep. She thought of the concrete, the hymns, the aging parish still singing above a grave they never knew existed. Now she understood. This wasn't negligence. It was strategy. Mercy weaponized to protect power. Later that night, in the empty gym of St. Margaret's, construction crews finished removing the last of the flooring. The hollow cavity where Mary Ellen had been found lay open again, cold and still. Hernandez crouched beside it, flashlight trembling in her grip. A single cross remained wedged in the dirt, initials carved crudely into the wood. TDK. She ran her thumb across them, and for the first time she pitied the old coach. Not for what he'd done, but for what belief had turned him into, a man who confused silence with salvation. When she left, Detroit's streets glistened under the rain. Somewhere, church bells rang across the skyline. Each toll felt more like an accusation than a prayer. She called King as she drove. We have everything we need, she said. Letters, payments, testimony. Enough to make an arrest. Enough to burn down an illusion. King hesitated before speaking. You realize taking this public means war with the archdiocese. They'll tear you apart. Hernandez stared out at the wet city through her windshield. Good. Maybe that'll wake them up. As she drove past St. Mary's Cathedral, its spires cutting into the storm, she thought about the men who walked those halls decades ago, priests, coaches, janitors, each carrying a secret that became part of Detroit's foundation. The city had been preying on a grave, and no one knew it. Her phone buzzed, a new message from the forensics lab. The results were final. Traces of fresh concrete dust on Mary Ellen's clothing didn't match the gym at all. The mix came from an older wing of the building, closer to the boiler room, suggesting she'd been hidden first, then moved later. Her chest tightened. That meant someone else, after Keenan's panic, had decided where she should finally rest. Someone with authority, access, and absolute conviction. She whispered to herself, Burke wasn't the last step. He was the middle. When she pulled over, she realized where she was, right outside St. Margaret's again. The courtyard was drenched, the statue of the Virgin streaked with rain like tears. She stood beneath it, her umbrella shaking in the wind. They said truth must sleep, she murmured. Then I'll be the one to wake it. And in that quiet, as thunder rolled above the rooftops, she swore that Mary Ellen Dwyer's story would not end where it began. Not sealed under stone, not silenced by faith, but alive again in truth. By dawn, Detroit was a battlefield of faith and fury. The morning news carried the story every parish had tried to deny. Evidence linked the 1963 murder of Mary Ellen Dwyer to a church cover-up orchestrated by Monsignor Leonard Burke. Headlines spread across Michigan like wildfire, and for the first time in decades, the city's reverence for St. Margaret's turned into outrage. Detective Laura Hernandez watched the chaos unfold from the precinct's lobby TV. Outside, cameras pressed against the glass as parishioners shouted at one another in the rain, some demanding justice, others demanding silence. Truth had arrived, and it didn't ask permission. Beside her sat Sam King, exhausted but alert after 3 consecutive days of investigation and writing. His article, The Buried Truth of St. Margaret's, had hit the front page that morning. It named names, quoted letters, exposed payment records, all verified and undeniable. Hernandez admired his courage even as she braced for the storm that was sure to follow. You realize they'll come after you, she said quietly. Let them, King replied. I've been sued before. Never by God's lawyers, though. The Archdiocese held a press conference that afternoon, insisting the documents were taken out of context, and that no active clergy living today bear any connection to the events of 1963. The bishop's tone was calm, his wording rehearsed, but behind his eyes, Hernandez saw fear. The church wasn't denying the crime. It was fearing the precedent. If one secret could be unearthed, others could follow. Later that evening, Hernandez was called to testify before the Attorney General's Special Task Force reviewing the case. She laid out the timeline: Keenan's confession, McGrath's letters, Callahan's payments, Burke's directives. When she finished, the room sat in silence. The facts were too old for prosecution under murder statutes, but not too old for moral consequence. A member of the panel asked, "Detective, in your opinion, who is ultimately responsible?" She didn't hesitate. Monsignor Leonard Burke led the cover-up, but every person who stayed silent helped bury that girl again and again. When the hearing adjourned, King met her on the courthouse steps. "They'll protect the name, not the truth," he said. Hernandez looked past him to the crowd gathering beyond the barricades, former students, priests, victims of other long-buried scandals. "Then we protect the truth," she replied. In the days that followed, the public split sharply. Some parishioners left the church in protest. Others doubled down in loyalty, framing Hernandez and King as persecutors of faith. The city's Catholic schools faced inspections, donations plummeted, and priests received hate mail and death threats. But the two investigators kept pushing. One night, Hernandez returned to St. Mary's Cathedral to re-examine Burke's crypt. The bronze slab glimmered faintly in the candlelight. She noticed something she hadn't before, a small, engraved Latin phrase near the bottom: "Documentum in pace." She pried the metal gently with a tool from her coat pocket. It gave way with a soft click. Behind it lay a narrow recess, sealed with wax. Inside was a thin envelope marked with the diocesan seal. Her pulse quickened as she removed it. Inside, folded carefully, was a final letter dated 1967, written in Burke's own hand. Asterisk, "To those who come after me. The girl's fate is known to heaven. I preserve the church, not to escape judgment, but to delay it. The truth will raise its own voice. May God forgive the weak hands that built his house on sin." Asterisk. No signature. Only initials, L.B. The next morning, she placed the letter on King's desk. "He knew," she said simply. King read it twice. Then he confessed, same as the others. "Not to the police," she replied. "To history." They both knew what it meant. This letter didn't change the case legally, but it confirmed everything morally. No further denials could erase it. The church had already written its own verdict years ago. Within days, the Attorney General's office released an official statement acknowledging the cover-up. Monuments of authority began to tremble. Church leaders promised a thorough internal review, while parish schools across Michigan instituted mandatory transparency reforms. It was the smallest possible step toward redemption, but at least it was forward. Hernandez, though, couldn't feel triumph. She only felt exhaustion. She drove to Holy Cross Cemetery, where Mary Ellen's new grave rested under a simple white headstone engraved with her name and a carved rosary. A small crowd stood under gray skies for the modest reburial service, survivors, family, and strangers alike. Patrick Dwyer, now 83, approached her after the ceremony. "My mother used to pray for her soul every night," he said softly. "Now we can pray for peace." "You gave her that," Hernandez told him. He shook his head. "No, you did." As the crowd dispersed, Hernandez lingered, listening to the rain tapping softly against the stone. She thought about McGrath's plea for forgiveness, Keenan's hollow eyes in the interrogation room, and Burke's final words about weak hands building God's house. They were all guilty. Each believed silence could be holy. But silence had destroyed them all. Sam King joined her a few minutes later, holding an umbrella. "You know," he said, "in the early stories, people wanted villains and miracles. But this isn't that kind of story." "No," she said, glancing at the grave. "It's about what people choose to protect, and what they destroy doing it." They stood there until the rain thinned, both aware that Detroit would never see the church the same way again. In the months that followed, the scandal reshaped the city's spiritual landscape. Parishioners demanded accountability. Families reopened painful memories. Former students began sharing long-suppressed stories of boundary violations and whispered threats. The church's control over silence had finally ended, but the noise that replaced it was equally terrifying. By the end of the year, the archdiocese formally apologized. Donations rebuilt youth shelters and funded investigations into other abuses once ignored. The headlines faded, but the wound remained. As winter returned, Hernandez visited the old St. Margaret's gym one last time before its demolition. The smell of dust and wet would fill the air. Workers paused as she stepped through the wide holes in the floor, flashlight in hand. She stopped where the concrete had been cut open months ago, the spot where Mary Ellen had been found. Kneeling, she set down a small bouquet of lilies. "You're free now," she whispered. Behind her, Sam King lifted his camera, but she turned and shook her head. "No pictures," she said. "Let her rest." For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over the city skyline. The same sound from 1963, a storm returning to the same streets, reminding Detroit how easily truth had drowned beneath faith. When she finally stood, she felt lighter. The case was closed, but its meaning wasn't. As they walked out together, King asked what she'd tell another detective facing a case like this. She smiled faintly. "Never trust silence," she said. "It hides everything worth finding." That night, the bells of St. Mary's rang again, steady, solemn, almost hesitant. But for the first time in 62 years, they sounded honest. Winter held Detroit in silence. Snow covered church steps, the streets muted under gray light. After decades of secrets, the truth had finally surfaced, unraveling the trust that once bound the city to its faith. St. Margaret's was no longer a symbol of virtue. It was a wound, and everyone could feel it. Detective Laura Hernandez walked through the biting cold with her coat pulled tight. The case had ended weeks ago, yet the echoes of it surrounded her. People whispered in grocery lines, priests avoided her in public, and every Sunday, the bells of St. Mary's rang like an accusation. She'd exposed a story buried for 62 years, but victory had never felt so empty. At a diner near the river, Sam King sat opposite her, his hands cupping a mug gone cold. His article, The Buried Truth of St. Margaret's, had shaken the nation. Men in collars called it blasphemy. Survivors called it salvation. He looked tired. "They say I've turned people against God," he said. "Maybe I did." "You didn't," Hernandez replied. "You turned them toward the truth." He managed a faint smile. Funny how truth never feels holy. One afternoon, she drove out to see Father Riley's old care home, now empty. Its hallways smelled of disinfectant and dust. In the small chapel, worn prayer cards still lined the offertory box. She lit a candle, thinking of all the people who'd carried guilt they didn't deserve. "Peace isn't absolution," she whispered. "It's acceptance." The flame flickered once, steadying as if it agreed. On her way out, a nun stopped her. "You're the detective," she said gently. "I saw you on television. People needed what you did." "Did they?" Hernandez asked. "Yes," the sister replied. "Sometimes faith needs a wound to remember it's alive." Driving back through the city, Hernandez noticed how Detroit moved slower now, as if savoring calm. Murals appeared on empty walls, portraits of lost children, candles painted in bold colors, verses calling for truth and renewal. One mural depicted Mary Ellen smiling under a sky of birds. A quote beside it read, "Forgiveness begins where silence ends." She parked nearby and stood before it for a long time, the late-day sun warming her face. Her phone buzzed, a message from King with a link to his final documentary episode. The title read, "The City That Finally Listened." She smiled and turned off the screen. She didn't need to watch. She'd lived every frame. That night, rain rolled in, soft and steady. Hernandez sat by her apartment window, the wooden fragment from St. Margaret's still resting on her desk. Its carved initials had faded to pale scratches, but to her, they were brighter than ever. She replayed moments in her mind: the interrogation room, the letters, the excavation, the sound of truth cracking through decades of denial. Every piece of it had changed her. Not broken her, not exactly, but reshaped her into something harder to silence. As thunder murmured beyond the glass, she whispered, "You can rest now." Whether the words were meant for Mary Ellen, herself, or the city didn't matter. All three had carried the same burden. In the months ahead, she planned to leave the department. King had suggested writing a book together. She wasn't sure yet. For now, she preferred quiet, mornings without alarms, nights not haunted by case files. She wanted to remember Detroit not for its secrets, but for how it endured. Before turning out the light, she opened McGrath's journal one last time. The final line read, "Truth will raise its own voice." She traced the words with her thumb and closed the cover. Outside, church bells began to ring again, slow and solemn. But tonight, they didn't sound like guilt. They sounded alive. Detroit wasn't holy, not anymore. But under those bells, honest, flawed, awake, it was something better. It was human. Summer arrived slowly, as if testing whether Detroit was ready for warmth again. Months had passed since the scandal, but the city still carried its bruise. Some churches closed, others reopened with fewer pews filled. Yet every Sunday the bells rang, no longer in triumph, but in honesty. It was a city finally learning how to tell the truth. Detective Laura Hernandez had taken a new position with the Victims Advocacy Bureau, far from the noise of cameras and headlines. She worked in a modest downtown office, counseling families who were reopening old wounds of their own. Every case she touched reminded her of Mary Ellen, proof that one truth was never enough. Others always waited, just beneath the surface. That morning she walked through Mary Ellen Dwyer Park. Grass had grown thick and green over the ground where St. Margaret's once stood. The city had built a playground where the gym had been, with swings glinting under morning light. Children's laughter broke the quiet, strange and beautiful against the space that had carried generations of silence. She thought of that night in 1963, the rain, the fear, the voices erased, and the difference now was impossible to miss. The city had reclaimed its innocence with noise. Sam King joined her near the fence, camera strap across his chest. "It almost looks normal," he said. "It is," she replied. "Just not the kind we used to call normal." He handed her a newspaper. The headline read, "Detroit's Faith After the Fall." Below it, a photo of the park filled the page. "They asked me to give a speech at the journalism conference next week," he said, "about how stories like ours change institutions." "Tell them stories don't change institutions," Hernandez said. "People do." They walked together slowly, each step deliberate. Detroit had changed, no longer pretending to be pure, yet stronger in its imperfection. Parishioners shared their doubts openly. Families that once hid abuses came forward. The church had been broken open, but through that fracture came something fragile and new: accountability. Later that afternoon, Hernandez visited St. Mary's Cathedral. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, washing the marble floor in soft colors. A young priest greeted her quietly at the door. "Detective," he said, "we keep your name in our prayers." She almost laughed at the irony. "You don't have to." "We do," he said, "because truth is faith too." She lingered inside long after the prayer service ended. The church felt different now, stripped of grandeur, smaller but more human. The choir sang softly in the distance. Their voices trembled instead of soaring. And she thought, maybe that's what honesty sounded like. Outside, Detroit pulsed with new energy. Protesters and parishioners occupied the same sidewalks, not as enemies, but as neighbors finally speaking the same language. Some still accused her of betraying the church, claiming she'd shamed holy men. Others approached just to thank her, their voices trembling with relief. The following week, she attended a city forum on institutional reform. Reporters filled the aisles, but Hernandez kept her distance at the back wall until the moderator called her name. Murmurs rose as she walked to the podium. "I'm not a crusader," she began. "I'm just a cop who found the truth convenient enough to hide under concrete. People say we destroyed faith, She paused, meeting their eyes. Maybe we rebuild it. Faith without truth isn't holy, it's hollow. Applause filled the chamber, hesitant at first, then steady. Outside afterward, Sam King offered her his usual grin. You sound like someone who forgave the city. Maybe I did, she said. But I'll never forgive silence. That evening she returned home to her quiet apartment overlooking the river. The sky blushed gold over the city's skyline. On the windowsill rested the wooden fragment with carved initials. *M.E.D. Asterisk. She'd kept it there since the trial ended. The edges had worn smooth, the letters faint, yet it still caught light in a way that made her pause. She touched it gently, feeling its weight. Her phone buzzed, a message from Sam, another inquiry opened, this time in Chicago. She smiled, replying asterisk. Truth travels fast when it's finally free. Asterisk. Rain began to fall outside, soft and rhythmic. It drummed on the windows the same way it had in her earliest memories of that file. The cold, gray day she'd reopened it. Now, the sound held no dread, only peace. Before bed, Hernandez walked once more through the park. The lights shimmered across wet grass, and somewhere nearby, a church bell chimed midnight. She looked up at the empty sky and whispered, Sleep easy, Mary Ellen. They hear you now. Detroit still bore its scars, but they no longer hid them. The city had rebuilt itself through exposure, not repair, choosing truth, even when it hurt. And in that painful honesty, Hernandez finally saw something sacred. Not faith. Something truer. Something alive. Autumn returned with a crispness that felt like closure. Detroit moved slower now, more deliberate, no longer racing to bury pain. The leaves in Mary Ellen Dwyer Park turned shades of brass and red, coating the grass where children's laughter still echoed. The playground wasn't just a memorial anymore. It had become part of the city's daily rhythm, proof that life had reclaimed what fear once owned. Detective Laura Hernandez often walked there before sunrise. She'd make one slow lap around the park, coffee steaming in her gloved hand, the faint sound of the river rolling in the distance. It was quiet, still enough to hear the city breathe again. To her, that sound was victory. She had retired from the police department 6 weeks earlier. No speeches, no ceremony, just a final signature and a nod from the captain who had once told her to stay out of church business. Now, her badge rested wrapped in cloth inside a drawer. She didn't miss it. Justice, she'd realized, doesn't always need a uniform. That morning, Sam King met her near the old fence line, a scarf loose around his neck, a stack of notes under one arm. He'd just finished his book, the one he'd threatened to write since the day she reopened the cold case. Title simple, he said. Asterisk, the girl beneath the gym. Asterisk. She smiled. It's fitting. Some say it's too raw, he continued, shrugging. But I think people need to read what silence looks like. They sat on a bench near the swings, wind carrying the faint smell of wet leaves. King studied the horizon. You ever think we did more harm than good? Hernandez shook her head. The truth doesn't harm people, Sam. It saves them. Lies just take longer to die. He nodded slowly, eyes distant. You should have written a chapter. It'd sound better coming from you. I already lived mine, she replied. They fell silent, watching a group of kids play tag across the grass. The city had survived exposure, not unscarred, but awake. For every parish that closed, 2 new community centers opened. For every family broken by what had been uncovered, new ones found the courage to speak. The church's authority had fractured, but from its cracks came people willing to rebuild faith on honesty instead of obedience. That afternoon, Hernandez stopped by St. Mary's Cathedral. The air inside was warmer now, filled with the hum of quiet conversation. In one corner, volunteers stacked boxes of donated clothes for outreach programs. The priest, young, earnest, different, recognized her. Detective Hernandez, he greeted, the title still following her like a benediction. The city owes you more than it can repay. She smiled faintly. Detroit doesn't owe me. It owed her. You've given her peace, he said. She gave it to herself, Hernandez replied. We just finally listened. She lit a candle near the altar, the same place where, months earlier, she'd whispered forgiveness without knowing if she meant it. The wax dripped slowly down its side, catching the light like melting gold. Outside that small flame, the city flickered with noise again, buses, prayers, life. As she left, the late afternoon sun caught the cathedral windows, throwing streaks of color across her face. For a moment, she thought of the men who had once stood in that same light, Burke McGrath, Keenan, each convinced silence could sanctify sin. She wondered if they ever imagined their quiet empire would end in a park full of laughing children and cracked marble walls. Outside, Sam waited by his car. "The publisher wants a quote from you," he said. "One line to close the book." Hernandez thought for a moment. "Write this. Astra's truth doesn't destroy faith. It tests it, and if it's real, it survives. Asterisk." He grinned. "You sure you don't want co-author credit?" "I'm sure," she said. "This story belongs to her." That evening, rain began to fall again, the same soft drizzle that had marked nearly every turning point of the case. Hernandez walked home through the quiet streets, hood pulled low, letting the sound wash around her. Detroit had become something new, something she couldn't name, but could finally trust. At her apartment, the wooden fragment rested on the windowsill, the carved initials almost invisible now, but not forgotten. She picked it up and held it beneath the lamp's glow. "You're still here," she whispered. "That's enough." Her reflection in the glass showed a woman changed, older, steadier, but lighter somehow. She'd carried truth across 6 decades of denial, and it had carried her right back to peace. As night deepened, she stepped onto the balcony. The wind rustled through branches, and far in the distance, cathedral bells began to ring. For the first time, their sound blended with the laughter from the park below, the past and present sharing the same air. She looked out over the city, the streets gleaming after rain, lights flickering on the river, and whispered to the skyline, "You remember her now." Detroit did remember. It remembered Mary Ellen Dwyer and everything her silence had cost. But it also remembered the courage that finally broke it. And under that remembrance, with bells echoing faintly into the night, the city kept breathing, not broken, not holy, but honest at last.
For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.